Hello, and welcome to the Outcry Theatre Podcast. I'm Becca Johnson-Spinos, and I'm the Artistic Director of Outcry Theatre. Every episode of this podcast delves into the artistic process of creating theatre. This episode is about our current production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, adapted by Simon Stevens from the novel by Mark Haddon. Hi, it's Miss Becca, and I'm here with my two actors who are playing Christopher in The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Hello, I'm Dylan Weand.
Hi, I'm Will McDonald.
Hi, guys. Thanks for doing this. Okay, I want to start out with you guys talking to me a little bit about the show in general. What's it about?
It's about an autistic boy named Christopher who finds his neighbor's dog dead and tries to find out who killed the dog, and in searching for the murderer, he finds a lot of mysteries about himself and his family.
What was your first exposure to Curious Incident?
A few years back, I saw Curious Incident on Broadway, and seeing it was just such an amazing show, seeing just, a group of actors providing a story from such a different perspective from our own, and seeing the show, I saw that role in that show and just said, I would kill to be in this play, and it was really just awe-inspiring.
My first exposure to The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime was when a high school in the region performed it, and I had never heard of the show, but just seeing the show, it really grabbed my attention, and I knew I fell in love with the story, and I really wanted to do it. And about almost a year later, now I'm actually taking part in it, and it's pretty crazy.
So would you guys say you're playing your dream role right now?
Heck yes.
Absolutely.
So as Will mentioned earlier, Christopher is autistic. And how have you guys approached playing such a difficult character, and particularly his autism? What sort of research did you do, and how does it affect all the ways that you move and the ways that you behave on stage?
I did quite a bit of research about autism and just the entire autistic spectrum before even auditioning for the role. There's so many there's not specific cases for everything. Everyone's on a spectrum and everyone's different. So I kind of came with that mindset going into Christopher, about he's his own person and we don't have to put specific labels on him and what he does. I read a little bit about it in a book, and then I just did a lot of research online.
People with autism are just as diverse and unique as people without autism, and to approach Christopher with unique choices and unique characteristics was really, I think, kind of the way to go on how to make Christopher seem authentic.
As the boys both mentioned, we just made some decisions about how Christopher was going to behave specifically, based on, of course, research in the way that other people might respond or behave, and obviously based on the script and what the script calls for and what the character calls for. But we just made some decisions and we sort of stuck with them, which is actually sort of how Mark Haddon, who wrote the novel, sort of created Christopher. He just made some decisions about how Christopher felt about the world and how Christopher responded to the world. And he just stuck with those decisions. So how does that affect the way you guys behave, specifically?
I feel like Christopher, he has, a lot of physical tics that he does. And, some of them suit certain situations. Sometimes they're casual ones. Other times they're almost defensive ones. And it almost seems like, these tics are kind of his way of coping. And he also has other things that aren't necessarily actual, actions so much as just different things about him. He doesn't make eye contact with people. He doesn't even look in their general direction. Sometimes people don't think he's even listening to them, even though he is, just because he lives in his own world almost that makes sense to him, but not always to others. It's interesting incorporating all of these tics and habits into Christopher's character to, make him seem real.
We've developed this system of him coping with the world and how he sees and deals with the world. just through these little motions, like of grabbing his pants because he's very stressed or high tension and just can't look people in the eye because for him it's painful in a way that we might not ever understand.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch you guys do it because I think at the beginning you guys were really similar because we had sort of made decisions about how, I mean, this sounds super specific, but we were like, okay, well, he's going to tug on his pants. He's going to rub the back of his head. He's going to play with his hoodie strings. And those were kind of like the three things we sort of like set aside of various different ways in which he was going to respond to the world around him. And so they were very similar at first. And now they both have very different ways of doing the same thing, but in such a different manner. Just because Christopher has become more and more real, basically, for all of us as we've been working on him.
Just throughout the process, I realized how there's new tendencies while playing Christopher that I do just because of his dad. His dad might trigger a certain response, but it's not anything we really discussed. It's just has developed through the process, and now it's like how my Christopher would react in this situation, and it's actually really cool.
This show is told very much from the perspective of Christopher. What does that mean exactly, and how does that influence the show?
Not only is it about Christopher, but it's also almost told in Christopher's head. So there are a lot of parts of the play that are the way Christopher imagines and sees them and visualizes himself doing. So, if he's talking about being an astronaut, he'll float into the air, and there's a lot of really neat things like that where you're getting to understand really what Christopher is thinking rather than just what he's seeing and doing. And it's almost a deeper level of understanding of Christopher because it's written, the show is supposed to have been written by Christopher.
There's like cubes that symbolize his organization, and there's even like going to be similar of a grid on the floor. We're going to have dots, but it's all of just his organization and how he sees the world.
Why don't you guys, to that end, talk a little bit about the train sequence when Christopher takes a train for the first time in his life and how the audience might experience that differently than, say, a regular character getting on a train and taking a train in a regular play.
For Christopher, getting on a train, especially by himself, it changes the world for him. He's never really been outside of his neighborhood. He's not used to being with so many people. And, to us, being on a train seems like no big deal at all. But to Christopher, that's like, it's a fearful thing for him. It's so frightening.
Yeah, and there's a few sequences, either in the train station or on the train, of him just having these sensory overloads, and it's very non-realistic to try to show the audience what might be going through Christopher's head, and it's a really cool way of visualizing what he's dealing with and how he's feeling at that moment.
We're doing a trick we've never done before, which we do a lot of lifts here at Outcry, and we're walking on the wall. What's it like to walk on the wall?
You see everything sideways. But in actuality, it's actually really quite the experience, because you would never think you were going to walk on the wall, but Christopher sure does.
Are you terrified, Will?
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. It's pretty high up there, but it's really neat. It's a really cool thing that we've never done before.
So we talked a lot about the sort of realistic way in which Christopher deals with the world, and we've talked a little bit about the non-realistic way in which we see sort of his inner mind. But would you sort of talk about some of the physical ways in which we see that and how he moves in a completely different way than he does in the real world?
I'm going to talk a little bit about the the detective Christopher sequences, because I really like those sequences. So it's a Christopher that's you would never. It's just totally unrealistic in his manner, but it shows his drive to really be looking for this thing. But Christopher is crawling all over the floor and scooching around in a circle at high speeds and whipping around on those walls, melting all over the place. And it's just a really cool way of showing how Christopher's experiencing this detection, and he's living in his own little detection world.
Christopher's thoughts and feelings almost translate into the movements in such like fluid and seamless way, and you can tell exactly what he's thinking just by seeing what he's doing, which is really, really a cool thing with the choreography and the actions in the movement.
So I have directed probably over 60 shows in the past, 8 years or so. And I think this is the hardest role that I've ever directed. And I've directed some hard stuff and asked some actors to do some pretty insane things. Tell me what the hardest thing is, or maybe a couple of the hardest things about playing Christopher.
Probably for me, the hardest part is just switching in and out of realistic Christopher and then kind of like dream Christopher, I guess you could say. A perfect example is the astronaut sequence or the train sequence, where Christopher will be running around in a circle around other people, and it's supposed to be, that is exactly what is happening in real life. He's running around, and then just out of nowhere, he's melting onto the ground and being lifted up into the air, and it's just so different, both acting-wise and physically. It's very demanding, but it's a lot of fun, and it's really interesting, identifying those switch points and what each part of it means, whether he's being realistic or non-realistic, and it's fun, but it is hard.
Christopher, while he's trying to get to a train station, he has to walk in a specific pattern, like say 2 steps to the left, 3 steps to the right. And so there's a super specific pattern we're walking on the floor, and it goes to like 5 steps, but it's like taking all these different turns and twists while we're saying this monologue on top of it. So it was really hard for me to learn this, because it was a balance of trying to learn. It's like patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time. It's just complicated and takes a lot of practice.
I know it's a spoiler, but I kind of think we should talk about math. So tell me a little bit about math.
So Christopher has to take a math test during the play, and he wants to go through how he solved the equation, but he decides in the end to explain how he solved the equation after the play is over and after he is bowed. So after it's all over, everyone's bowed, he comes back on to explain how he did this math equation and solved this math problem. And most other productions will just have Christopher standing there and have, the technical aspect be the impressive part of it. Lots of projections, lots of lighting, lots of sound. But at Outcry, we did a little bit more. We put it to music and turned it almost into a rap, I guess you could say. And it's choreographed with dancing and lifts and projections and sound and music. And so talking along with the music and dancing and knowing how to solve the math equation is pretty tough, but it's really very impressive to watch and very impressive to be in and fun.
Outcry Youth Theatre is doing Curious Incident unedited. What does that mean, and what's that been like in the rehearsal process?
The show has some explicit language in it. A lot of high schools do cut the language because it's a high school, but having the language in the show, it adds a level of just realism and the stress put on Christopher, because sometimes that language is even directed at him.
Hearing those, hearing cursing and hearing those words really is makes things hard for Christopher, because sometimes he doesn't understand what's going on. At one point, he even asks why the person is swearing because he just doesn't understand. And I feel like doing the show unedited really makes it more organic to see Christopher confused in that way.
What makes Curious Incident different than other productions you've been in?
The level of specificity of Curious Incident is definitely what makes it completely different than any other production, I would say. Everyone puts in so much work to make these great sequences happen and show Christopher's world, and it takes everyone doing their part, making the whole machine, the whole show work. And I would say that just makes Curious Incident quite different from any other show.
In the book, Christopher, he calls his mind almost like a machine. He says is how it helps other people understand how his mind works. And I almost feel like that's kind of what the show is like. It's all, a well-oiled machine that just happens consecutively. Every actor is on stage for almost the entirety of the show. It's all very like clean and cut, and it just all in a weird way, it almost feels like it's all one continuous movement from one scene to the next. It all just flows together. It is like a well-oiled machine.
I hate props. I hate them. And I really hate finicky props where you kind of really need the prop in rehearsal to make it happen. And this show has the wildest prop that I've ever had, because Christopher, as we mentioned, builds a train set on stage live. And I didn't know anything about electric train sets before I started this show. And now we're all very familiar with electric train sets because we have had to really, really put a grind on making sure that we know exactly how many pieces it is, the timing of exactly how it goes together, exactly when every piece moves, exactly when every house moves, exactly when every tree moves, and where it goes and how it happens. That sequence encapsulates for me what makes this show different than any other show. It should feel super easy, like it's an amazingly effortless thing when you're watching it, but the amount of time and energy and specificity and difficulty into each moment is really kind of out of this world. It's a much more difficult play than I even could have imagined, and I knew it was going to be difficult going in. We've talked a lot about Christopher, which is the main focus of the play, but he has a couple of really important relationships in the show, one being his teacher Siobhan and one being his father Ed. Talk a little bit about those relationships and how important they are in the play.
So Ed is essentially a single father to Christopher, and even though Christopher doesn't really see it, Christopher is basically Ed's entire world. You can see throughout the play as it progresses how much Christopher really means to Ed, and just having that relationship in the play is really interesting and really I think it's super emotional and super impactful.
Siobhan is Christopher's teacher. He goes to a special school, so she's basically his mentor, and Christopher needs Siobhan so much, and Siobhan is, you could argue, is one of the only people who really truly understands Christopher and his world. Later on, when Christopher is without Siobhan, when Christopher is by himself, he imagines Siobhan and imagines what she would tell him to calm him down. He thinks through what would Siobhan do. I really think that's really meaningful, and Siobhan really does care about Christopher, and a lot of the play is narrated by Siobhan reading what Christopher wrote, so which really kind of emphasizes how much she understands Christopher, and how much Christopher means to her, and how much really she means to Christopher.
I think a really crucial thing in the play, while it's told from Christopher's perspective, and we really are looking at the world through his eyes, we do, as an audience, see Ed and the way that Ed responds to Christopher. And one of the things that's really difficult for Ed is feeling like Christopher isn't listening to him or doesn't understand him or doesn't believe him. And it's powerful to see the struggle between two people who really care about each other and really want to connect, be unable to, whether that's because Ed doesn't really know how to talk to Christopher or because Christopher can't give Ed the reassurance that Ed needs emotionally. It's a really, really interesting juxtaposition to see that on stage and to see how the relationship progresses throughout the show. Why should people come see Outcry Youth Theater's production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime? Other than to see you guys.
Okay, I know a lot of productions say they put a lot of work into the show, but like, I'm not kidding. We put so much work into this show. And we're really just trying to bring Christopher's world to life. And I think people really enjoy seeing his perspective and just really enjoy the show. It's a really funny, but also really impactful show. It makes you think about a lot of things and the people in your life and just people around you, I would say.
The show is just it's so meaningful, and seeing such a wild story told from someone else's perspective who doesn't think the way that you may think is it's amazing. You know, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. You know, most shows aren't written from the perspective of someone, you know, with autism, and it's really amazing to see how other people may think and to experience this, you know, just wild, fun, amazing, you know, emotional adventure.
I was absolutely terrified to start this process because I found Christopher very, very difficult to connect with because I am someone who loves big emotional characters who wail and gnash their teeth when things don't go their way. These people who are super expressive. And I just could not. I had a really hard time feeling like I was connecting to this character. And I wanted to bring him to life truthfully and honestly. And I wanted him to feel real. And I wanted him to feel like himself, not just like what I wanted him to be. And it's been such an amazing thing to work with Will and Dylan, bringing him to life and making him feel real and really connecting with him and growing to really like love him and care about him and almost have him feel like a real person to me, and I think to all three of us. And so it's just been a wild ride, and I'm so excited to finally see it all come together. Thank you so much for joining us for our latest episode of the Outcry Theatre Podcast. You can purchase your tickets or find out more about Curious Incident at outcrytheatre.com. This podcast has been produced by me, Becca Johnson-Spinos, and was edited by Jason Johnson-Spinos. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your theater-loving friends.